Welcome to the Retail Focus Podcast, a weekly collection of news, interviews, and information from the world of retail.
Welcome to this edition of the Retail Focus Podcast. I'm Trent Kling. Coming up on today's show, we've got a couple of news stories to talk about of regional importance. We'll also look ahead to Walgreens Boots Alliance earnings coming up this next week. More importantly, those front store sales that we always talk about. We'll also talk to Colby McKenzie, who is the co-founder and also a board member at Enlighten. This is an interview we actually aired right before the pandemic, or just before the pandemic hit last February. I think it's important for us to revisit because there were certain aspects of the interview, obviously it would be easy to overlook with the pandemic, but we're going to talk a little bit about scaling up in the education surrounding CBD and retail. I think it's a fascinating interview, one that is certainly worth visiting, and it came last year at a time when, again, a lot of people were looking ahead to the pandemic, so very much worth revisiting now that you see these products and the proliferation of these products continue to hit retail stores. By the way, coming up next week, we had a couple of reschedules. So next week, we'll actually be joined by Dick Sullivan. He's the CEO of PGA Tour Superstore and the former CMO at Home Depot. We'll talk to him about both of those experiences and how it shaped his retail career. Also, in a couple of weeks, we'll be joined by Jim Johnson of FIS. He'll be joining us to discuss a couple of reports regarding retail payments throughout the globe, and both looking at generational differences and regional differences that FIS is seeing on those fronts. So like I said, some reschedules resulting in a shuffling of our interviews coming up, but a couple of great ones in particular. Certainly looking forward to talking to Dick Sullivan, who, by the way, PGA Tour Superstore had an absolute banner year last year, despite the fact that they were closed for about 50 days during the beginning of the pandemic. And he'll talk about how they were able to have such success in the midst of a global pandemic. Well, a reminder, the cursory one, that you can rate us or subscribe to us through any podcast listening service. And also, you can check us out on social media at Retail Podcast on both Instagram and Twitter. So a lot of news stories in retail this week, and we wanted to go away from the earnings calls a little bit because there were some news stories of regional note that I felt were worth talking about because it's important to frame them certainly through a national lens. And we begin in the C-Store segment as Casey's expands through an agreed-upon acquisition of Oklahoma Circle K stores. Of course, everything has to be signed off, approved upon by the FTC, but the announcement made this week, and they were very clear during their last earnings call that they expected acquisition activity in the C-Store industry as a whole, but certainly for Casey's as well, to remain at a reasonably high level in 2021. Very clear during the call itself that they had a few deals already in the works, and this was likely the biggest of them. They capped off 2020 by reaching a deal to acquire 94 Buc-ee's convenience stores in Nebraska, Illinois, and as far south as Texas. Now, I do want to make a note, this C-Store chain is not to be confused with the Buc-ee's travel center chain that's so popular in Texas, the one with the beaver logo. You've probably, if you've been around retail or been anywhere near the South, you've probably seen that logo somewhere. But this last deal, the deal that they reached in November 2020, still pending FTC approval as of right now. But the most recent deal, these stores are going to be acquired from Couche-Tard, who owns the Circle K banner in the U.S. Overall, 49 stores in Oklahoma will be acquired for what is a fairly reasonable price tag of $39 million. Now, $39 million for Casey's represents the upfront price tag, but a lot of these locations are going to be in need of renovation to support Casey's Pizza and other fresh food offerings that they are so well known for their over 2,200 locations in the Midwest to this point. Now, for Casey's, Oklahoma has never been their strongest market in terms of store count. When you think of Casey's, you think Upper Midwest, you think Illinois, you think Iowa, you think Missouri. You don't really think Oklahoma, and currently they do have around 40 Oklahoma stores, so this deal will aim to double their Oklahoma footprint. And from a demographic standpoint, Oklahoma seems to be a perfect match for Casey's. You got a number of small and mid-sized towns there, certainly a number of highways going through those towns that are used for interstate travel, for interstate commerce. So as a result, you would think certainly it would be high on Casey's radar to get into Oklahoma because makeup-wise, very similar to areas like Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, areas that I've already mentioned. Casey's has a massive footprint in. Now, in larger metros, talking about Oklahoma, Quick Trip has a firm grip on Tulsa. On-Q, 7-Eleven, Circle K, Love's, they split a very open Oklahoma City market. There's no one convenience store chain that really has the significant grip on the Oklahoma City market, which is the largest one, of course, in Oklahoma. Now, one thing worth noting is that Love's is located in Oklahoma City. They, of course, have a significant number of locations throughout the I-40 and I-44 corridors, as well as the US 54, US 81, and US 69 corridors. Again, major thoroughfares for interstate travel, interstate commerce, those. And as a result, Love's, which is seen more as a travel center, has a number of locations in Oklahoma. But, I think it's very interesting to point out, and as someone who has spent a significant amount of time in Oklahoma, whether it be for business or for travel, in Oklahoma, Love's is seen more as a typical convenience store and has decent to excellent brand equity there. In Oklahoma, Love's is really a lot closer to what a Casey's might be in the Des Moines market. So I think it's important to frame this conversation around that, the fact that Love's is based in Oklahoma. They have a large following there, and they're very similar to a Casey's, except, of course, more of a travel center. They've got more assistance for truckers and the like. Now, all of this acquisition, the expansion southward by Casey's, this all ties in with Casey's recent construction of that distribution center in Joplin, Missouri, something we mentioned when we talked about their last earnings call. That's set to be their most southerly distribution center. They've got one in Indiana, they've got one in Iowa, but almost certainly these new acquisitions are facilitated by the building of this distribution center. Now, would they have acquired the stores if they weren't in the midst of buying this distribution center? Well, maybe, but we can say with absolute certainty this Joplin, Missouri distribution center is going to be servicing these new locations, and we haven't heard about where specifically these locations will be in terms of areas throughout the state, but one has to wonder, maybe this is going to signal a strong entry into the Oklahoma City market because, again, a lot of Circle K there, or instead, maybe it's going to strengthen Casey's network in rural areas, which is typically their bread and butter. Now, from Couche-Tard's perspective, this is the tip of the iceberg as they look to continue to divest locations. After a strategic review, in fact, they sought to divest 355 North American stores over the next few years in total. Now, this takes 49 of their stores off of the books, of course, but they've retained NRC Realty and Capital Advisors to work the sale of the other 306 locations. Of those 306 remaining, 269 are in the U.S., across 25 states. So you're looking at a more spread out geographic footprint than the lump of 49 stores in Oklahoma, and this likely isn't the last we've heard of an expanding regional operator like Casey's buying up these locations. And you have to wonder why Oklahoma is the only place Casey's is buying locations with so many locations on the market. Maybe they'll be in the running for a few of the others down the road. And we should note that about 22% of the remaining locations to be sold are convenience only. So that's going to take operators like Casey's, like Come and Go, where fuel is a major part of their operations, probably out of the running for those. But it's something to keep an eye on at a national level because you're likely to see a number of smaller convenience store deals as Couche-Tard attempts to, as they might say, right-size their operations but finish up their strategic review after that big Circle K acquisition several years ago. Now, for the next regional store, I wanted to head just to the south of Oklahoma to Texas. Big grocery news hit this week. We spoke a few weeks ago to Alan Payne, who is once again the author of the book Built to Fail. Most of the book, of course, talking about the ascent and the descent of Blockbuster. But Alan, background at H-E-B, noted just how big of a presence H-E-B is there. And depending on which metric you look at, depending on which survey you look at, H-E-B even ranks as the top retailer or grocery retailer in the country via some of those. So that gives you an idea of how high esteem they're held in. And they mostly have a presence in South Texas. They've been noticeably absent from extreme northern Texas, including the DFW area. And there are a few scattered stores south and west of Fort Worth. There's some south of Dallas. I believe Waxahachie, Texas has a store, but that is until now. This story comes by way of the always excellent Maria Halkias of the Dallas Morning News. Maria notes that H-E-B had been buying land for more than 20 years in North Texas, but was waiting for the right time to expand. Something Alan talked about during his interview is the fact that H-E-B, kind of conservative in terms of their decision-making, in expansion, certainly expanding their area and different concepts. He mentioned that, of course, with the video store concepts there, but apparently the right time for H-E-B's flagship stores to expand is fall of 2022. The first 2 stores in the Dallas area will open. Ground is expected to be broken on the stores this summer. And H-E-B controls a good portion of the market share in places like San Antonio, Houston, Laredo, Austin. If you're from there, if you've ever been around there, you've probably seen them. You've probably gone into the stores. And you might say, well, Trent, why is this such a big deal? We're talking about 2 stores opening in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Why is it even worth talking about on a national retail news podcast? Well, despite their somewhat limited geographic area, Progressive Grocer has H-E-B 5th in revenue among U.S. grocers. And we should note that that doesn't include either Walmart or Target, but they're just behind Publix and just ahead of Meijer. 2 other regional favorites, 420 stores for H-E-B and all. And I liken this to what Publix began to do a few years ago, which is expand northward. They took a cult following, mostly in Florida, started to expand northward. I went to a Publix store just a year and a half ago in Richmond, Virginia, in a very similar circumstance. Publix opened up in a new housing development where there were no Walmarts, no Targets, and those are 2 companies that have basically stopped building new stores, which we'll talk about here in a second. Now, currently, just so you're aware, the Dallas-Fort Worth grocery scene is pretty heavily segmented between the usual suspects. Now, Walmart is the market leader there, or they're said to be the market leader there. Albertsons also has a major presence there through Tom Thumb and some other banners. Kroger, of course, through their flagship Kroger brand. Natural Grocers, Whole Foods, Sprouts, Trader Joe's, Aldi, warehouse stores. You also have regional chains there, Royal Blue Grocery, Fiesta Mart, which was, by the way, recently bought by an investment firm. And, of course, Walmart has their offshoot Walmart Neighborhood Market all over the place throughout the DFW area. And we should note that even though H-E-B doesn't have any flagship stores currently in the DFW area, they do have a few of their upscale central market concepts there already. 6, in fact, central market based out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area for H-E-B. Now, these 2 flagship stores will be located north of Dallas in Collin County. If you have not been to this area, it's an extremely fast-growing area. I was just there 2 weeks ago. They're building house after house. They can't keep up with the housing demand. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this expansion on the show is that there was a very interesting quote in the Dallas Morning News article from Herb Weitzman, who he's helped H-E-B locate new stores through the Weitzman real estate firm. He noted that Target and Walmart basically have stopped building stores to focus on digital growth. We talked about it on this podcast. We've talked about how most chains, even Kroger included, have pretty much stagnated in terms of brick and mortar growth. But he said the following, and I quote this: "Housing construction never stopped. There's more corporate relocations and job growth here, and that's fueling the housing market," end quote. Basically, he's suggesting that in areas of the country where you're seeing this massive housing growth, so Collin County is building out and northward from Dallas proper. Target, Walmart, other chains hesitant to continue to invest in brick and mortar, they run the risk of being a delivery-only option, completely playing themselves out of brick-and-mortar traffic in growing areas. That's something that H-E-B, with these 2 stores, aiming to take advantage of. And H-E-B, by the way, during the pandemic, has not slowed their development, obviously, in terms of brick-and-mortar stores. And it's something that we're likely to see more development from the likes of Publix as well. So as you have these big national names slowing things down so that they can invest in e-commerce, you have other regional chains, H-E-B, Publix among them, who recognize that grocery is very much a local thing, and brick and mortar traffic will continue to flow to grocery stores, and they're looking at possibly coming out of the pandemic, coming out of this surge to e-commerce, if you will, as a brick and mortar winner. And you can say, yes, but aren't sales going to e-commerce and grocery? Yep, that's very true. The bottom line is, though, even the most bullish of estimates pin grocery sales at 50-50 brick and mortar to e-commerce, which means if you're Walmart and Target and you're not building in these areas, you're basically throwing that market share away. And that's the most bullish of estimates. I've spoken with a lot of people, and again, the plural of anecdote is not data, but I've spoken with a lot of people that are relatively unhappy with the pickup and curbside services for grocery or the delivery services for grocery, just not getting the quality of the produce they're used to getting, not getting the products that they're used to getting in terms of picking their own. They're getting substitutions that they maybe didn't ask for or didn't want in the first place. And what's more is, if you buy these products online, you can't shop deals, you can't shop clearances. So if you're a budget-minded consumer, maybe the paradigm of e-commerce grocery just doesn't work out as well. H-E-B obviously knows all of this. This is not news to H-E-B. One of the reasons why they're building in one of the fastest growing areas in the country. Stephen Butt, by the way, was asked about the possibility of cannibalization from the existing central market stores. He noted customers really use both. They go to the central market stores if they want a more upscale experience, but he said that based on their research with the existing central market stores in Austin and other areas, even when customers start to use the central market stores, they still go to the flagship stores for aspects like the pharmacy there, for the more full service feeling of the stores. So interesting thought there, but again, this is a story to keep an eye out for, because I think it's these regional grocers 5-10 years down the line, we could be looking at this period of time where the big players in this space didn't build any new stores, didn't keep up with the new housing developments, and suddenly they find themselves out of certain areas altogether in terms of market share. So just something to store in the back of our heads there. So as I mentioned, our interview guest this week, it's a re-air of an interview that aired over a year ago. We'll talk with Colby McKenzie, again, principal at Enlighten Wellness. He's going to discuss retailer and consumer education surrounding the introduction of CBD and alternative wellness products to stores. It's not always just about CBD, although that's the one that carries the headlines, but he'll talk about why education is so important on all fronts in order to gain market traction for these products. We've talked in passing on the show about retailers adding CBD or other wellness products or seeking to add those type of products, but usually this is in the context of earnings calls and the like, so it's never been super in-depth, but we're going to change that today. We're joined by Colby McKenzie. He's the principal of Enlighten Wellness, a firm comprised of pharmacy owners, marketing professionals, and retail and technology experts. Enlighten Wellness assists independent retailers with their entry into the wellness space, but particularly the CBD space, which will kind of be the focus of today's interview. Colby, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
You bet. Happy to be here.
So first, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what Enlighten does on kind of a day-to-day there.
Yeah, of course. So at its core, Enlighten Wellness serves its retail partners as a category manager for alternative health products. However, unlike a traditional category manager or distributor, Enlighten uses its incredible retail technology to create a true store-within-a-store concept that we call the Enlighten Wellness Center. And this leverages a television screen sitting atop a product end cap to promote its products and provide general education on popular new products such as CBD.
So really, we're talking about, managing those products and the product's presence inside the retail stores, including CBD. But I just want to start with the general wellness products that you work with. First of all, can you speak to the rise that we've seen as far as not only CBD, but all of these alternative medicine products that are covered in these stores?
Yeah, and as a fitness and health buff myself, this has always been something that's been near and dear to my heart and something that I've tracked closely. But I think what you've seen over the last, let's call it 10 years, is really an unearthing of the fact that there are other ways to stay healthy, and more so than trying to cure something that is already ailing you. People have begun to really focus on preventative health, and a lot of times preventative health is centered around these alternative health remedies. And I think that has really been the key to the rise of this. And it's been exciting to watch as somebody that has a long-standing regimen of taking and utilizing these alternative health supplements. I think it's really fun to see it kind of become mainstream.
Now, of course, your firm works with a number of different retailers, most of them independent. I was wondering what some of the misconceptions were surrounding maybe CBD or alternative medicine products for some of these retail companies that you work with.
Yeah, so it's really two buckets of retailers. You have the retailers that have gone out and educated themselves and really understand that this is a fast-growing industry and a fast-growing product line as far as CPG goes, and are jumping in feet first, and in doing so, quickly realize, oh no, I might not have the education or the background to really thrive in this category. And those are the ones that we kind of hold their hand and really serve as that true category manager to help them kind of navigate this industry. Whereas you have the other bucket, which is quite the opposite. And these retailers are oftentimes a little less educated on alternative remedies, and in fact view them either as snake oil, or they see CBD and say, well, isn't that cannabis? And that can't be something that we have in our store. And with those, it really becomes education that we oftentimes are delivering to the consumer, backing that up a step and actually providing that same level of education to our retail partners to say, wait a second, I think maybe you have some preconceived notions or misnomers about alternative health as a whole and TBD in particular. And with those, it's just a matter of properly educating them. And then all of a sudden you see the light kind of switch on with those guys. And we turn around and say, now what we've done with you, let's do that with your customers and really provide that baseline of education for them.
Now, I know Enlighten does a lot of your primary work with independent retailers, thus the wide variance that you might see in terms of preconceived notions there. But I was wondering how the approach differs as far as dealing with independent retailers, trying to get them up to speed and making sure that they're seeing success in this category versus maybe a way a big box store might merchandise and market these products.
You bet. And so one of our kind of core mantras as we embarked on Enlighten Wellness was really seeing this gap in kind of the retail technology and the way that retailers approach their storefront, and seeing this big gap between, as you mentioned, big box and the independents. We wanted to offer these independents a tool that allowed them to really try and compete head to head with the big box. And so when it comes to, we'll use pharmacy as an example. You oftentimes walk into an independent pharmacy and they are top-notch pharmacists, but really a lot of times maybe have neglected or just don't focus on their front of store, when in reality your margins are big on front of store and your customers are already in the store ready to buy other products. So it just takes us stepping in and saying, how about we provide you with this retail technology tool that's going to essentially serve as an unpaid employee for you, that's going to be able to speak to these products that happen to be sitting right there on the shelf below the screen. And that understanding, and all of a sudden they say, wait, I can now compete with these big box retailers. I can now move into the 21st century retail and begin to be that experiential retailer, a place that becomes a destination more so than just a peddler of goods. And all of a sudden they kind of say, all right, if you're going to be that tool for me to compete with the big box, I'm all ears.
Now, we talk about these tools, of course. A lot of them have to do with the use of video there, in addition to the merchandising in the store. You mentioned the need to educate retailers sometimes, but what portion of being a successful retailer of CBD products has to do with that educational aspect, with providing the education to the consumer? And also, what type of feedback, what type of interactivity are you seeing with that video that you're providing in store as well?
Yeah, and it really becomes, to your point, a three-pronged approach. One, you have to have really great products and best-in-class products that not only are top-of-the-line quality, but also really have great branding. And then on top of that, you have to have those products that are in an easy-to-access spot. You don't want to be in the faraway dark corner. You want to be somewhere that's high traffic, easy access. And then kind of the cherry on top, and really what differentiates us and has allowed us to see really incredible sales velocity figures, is, to your point, the educational component. So sitting atop our Enlighten Wellness Center is going to be a screen that plays an array of education. And a lot of times when retailers think of digital signage, they immediately kind of have their eyes glaze over and start to think like, oh, it's going to play these 3 clips over and over and put everybody to sleep. So what we've done is our technology is actually very dynamic. So it's constantly pulling from a massive library and Rolodex of content specifically tailored to the products in that location. And it's going as far as providing trivia questions to kind of playfully ease you into the education process, all the way to kind of deeper dive understanding of here is an alternative remedy. Here's where it comes from. Here's the people that it might benefit and things of that nature. And all of a sudden you create this connection between education and purchase. Somebody that's highly educated all of a sudden becomes not only more likely to purchase, but more likely to be a very loyal purchaser and return to that place in which they received the education. And that's something that we've seen prove out over the course of time with Enlighten Wellness.
Well, and that's great news. Just a little bit about myself. About 20 years ago, I worked in a drugstore, and we had a video monitor there talking about muscadine grape juice, and it played the same clip, 3-minute clip, over and over and over again. So good to hear that it's pulling from a larger repository. One other thing you mentioned in that response, though, was you mentioned it really does come down to having a good product on the shelves. And I know you work with a number of product suppliers there. What's the process like? I'm kind of curious as far as vetting these products, especially in an industry that's relatively new, relatively recent when we're talking about CBD.
Yes, and it's been an interesting ride and something that we at the beginning said if we're stamping these products with the Enlighten Wellness kind of approval, we sure as heck better vet them really well. So we came up with a 7-step vetting process that's extremely rigorous, particularly on the CBD side. As you mentioned, you've had a lot of fly-by-night companies that kind of come and go, and really an issue with people creating products that don't even have enough CBD to benefit people in the way that is perhaps something that's out there benefiting these CBD consumers. And so what we do is we have really a couple pieces of the puzzle. One is the product has to be good looking, because when it's a new category, people are a little hesitant. But if it's a good looking product and one that kind of fits what people are interested in, you get their attention. But at the same time, if the product doesn't work or doesn't kind of meet the expectation of the consumer, then you're not going to get that repurchase. And so we're really, really hard on the process of making sure that what these SKUs claim to have in the product is actually in there. And that's kind of the process we go about creating kind of consistency, but also easing the mind of our retailers, because going out on your own as a retailer and going through this vetting process and having to deal with a number of potential product companies becomes a heavy lift. But when you rely on somebody that's already providing kind of a full integrated system that includes those products, then all of a sudden it takes that burden off of them, places it on us, and that's one that we're happy to carry.
And I am kind of interested because, being kind of a subject matter expert in this particular field, you work with a number of different retailers in a number of different parts of the country. And of course, not every market's going to be the same, but you also serve a number of small markets as well. And when we're talking about setting up this interview, this is something that really piques our interest on the show, is serving those small markets. How or to what extent does your approach change when it goes from, maybe setting up in market A versus market B, or a large versus small market?
To give a little background on that, we actually are in 19 states and serve a number of different retail types. We work with pharmacies, we work with natural food stores, and we recently have started working with grocery stores. So to your point, no two kind of parts of the country are alike, let alone no two types of retailers. And so we really take a very hands-on approach, because we've learned that, for example, we're working with kind of a regional Oregon and California chain right now that has 2 different laws as far as CBD between Oregon and California. And on top of that, has 2 very different demographics between customers in those 2 markets. So even within this one customer, we are tailoring and fine-tuning the products that go on the shelf to fit that demographic, and more importantly, to fit the legal kind of framework of each state. And then you take that on kind of a macro level, and not only are we really vetting and providing that category management on the products, but you also have to make sure that you're backing that up with education that fits that type of retailer. So the education that we're putting out there in a pharmacy may be a little more cut and dry and a little more focused on kind of true fact-based education, whereas something that may be in a grocery store may be a little more engaging and playful and have trivia along with kind of fact-based education. So we kind of are very, very tailored in our approach, and you almost have to be when you're working across this variety of kind of geographic diversity as well as retailer diversity. And I think it's kind of one of our core competencies that has allowed us to be very successful when it comes to sell-through.
And I wanted to close out with this because, as we've talked about several times during the course of this interview, you work largely with independent retailers, and it's said oftentimes that they have the flexibility to be a bit more nimble than obviously a huge, enormous national chain. How do you feel like that assists them in terms of the ability to introduce not only new lines of products, but new forms of that in-store marketing to advertise newer products, whether they be CBD or other alternative wellness solutions?
And I'll give you an example through a story, actually, and this just proves why independents, to your point, are nimble, and it does serve as a huge advantage. One of our regional sales reps was out in the field last month and just happened to stop by a really beautiful pharmacy. And they walk in, and this place is a great-looking pharmacy, and they walk up to the pharmacist who happened to be there that day and say, I have a solution for you that will fit right over in that part of the pharmacy. Aesthetically, it'll fit right in, and this is going to not only provide you with this cool retail tool, but I'm also willing to pull these products out of kind of the vehicle that I came in on, stick them on your shelf today, and you can take a look. And if this looks like something that fits, and if it looks like the products that you're willing to sell, I will literally walk out of here today and you can have this, and we can go from there. And sure enough, that would never happen in a big box. They would laugh at you and say, why don't you go through the multiple chains and multiple processes in order for this to be vetted? Whereas this independent pharmacist saw it sitting there and said, wow, that does look good. Where do I sign? Let's get this going. And sure enough, within 2 weeks, we're in all three of his locations. And it just kind of, the story I found resonates with the fact that independents sometimes forget that they have that advantage, to your point, of being nimble and being able to move quickly. And this really helps out in a number of ways, including getting up and running with us.
Finally, simply because you are so in tune with the industry, obviously this is a growing retail segment, whether it's CBD or alternative wellness solutions. Where do you see the future of this heading over the next 5-10 years?
I think you're going to see continued annual growth across not only CBD, which has absolutely been on fire, but funny enough, still isn't reaching from an education and understanding point, even half of America at this point. But at the same time, alternative wellness has this kind of groundswell that you're seeing more and more people say, how do I prevent? How do I prevent? I want to be healthy more so than just fixing problems. And I think that you're going to continue to see really rapid growth, but also an uncovering of a lot of really cool and unique new remedies in the coming years. And that's something that I think everybody should be excited for, but particularly independents, because they can rely on experts and really lean into these trends and be first movers, which serves them well.
Fascinating information. Once again, Colby McKenzie, Principal of Enlighten Wellness. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Retail Focus Podcast.
You bet. Happy to be here.
As always, we may have a position in or against companies we discuss on the podcast. Do not invest in stocks solely on the input of the podcast hosts.
Well, a lot of great insights once again from Colby, and we're going to keep it in that product segment for our looking ahead story, as Walgreens Boots Alliance is scheduled to release their earnings this coming week, March 31st, as a matter of fact. Now, over the last 3 earnings calls, if you take it in aggregate, they've more or less met estimates from analysts. That in and of itself is certainly something worth watching, is where their numbers come in. Obviously, we're going to be watching front store sales as well. However, one of the things that I am going to be watching certainly on this earnings call and listening for more appropriately is exactly how much traction they believe the people getting vaccines will actually have on the stores themselves. We've seen articles from everyone ranging from the Wall Street Journal to other publications. CNBC had an article out there talking about how retail pharmacies are positioned to succeed here over the next few months, especially in front of store sales, because of that crossover pandemic traffic, because of people coming in to get vaccines. Several of my good friends have gotten vaccinated already at a Walgreens or a CVS. So you can see it certainly on a limited level, but I am curious to see, because Walgreens usually is a pretty limited in terms of their own optimism, in terms of their outlook. If you're on their earnings calls, typically, one of the things I like about them is that they're very honest. They're very forthcoming and saying, hey, this probably isn't going to create that much of an effect. I'm anxious to see what kind of effect it's had so far in Q1 and the first month or so of Q2. Now, again, vaccine rollout, you're looking at the whole stretch of the pandemic. It's been fairly recent, just the last couple of months, really, where a number of people have started to get access to it. I know where I'm at in Colorado, what they call the Schedule 2 folks, or the second group, hasn't yet been able to go, which is basically everyone else that doesn't work in a service sector, not a teacher, et cetera, that's under a certain age. And so you really wonder what Walgreens is going to look at for Q2 and Q3 when the vaccine does open up to a broader audience based on what they learned already in Q1. So that's the main reason I'm looking ahead to this earnings call. I always like it when they talk about those front store sales, and Walgreens has struggled more in that category than have even Rite Aid and CVS, but certainly I think it's going to be a valuable earnings call for a lot of us in retail. Try and gain some of this knowledge. And we know that vaccine rollouts have obviously hit grocery stores as well. It's hit Kroger affiliates, Albertsons affiliates. Anxious to see whether those businesses start to see an uptick or whether it's going to be confined more to retail pharmacies. It's not something we've seen a lot of articles about, is the fact that grocers have certainly the opportunity to open up their stores for the vaccine, that are getting shipments of the vaccine. Rather, we're seeing these articles really center around retail pharmacies. So certainly a dynamic to keep an eye on over the next few months, but at least March 31st, we hope to get some clarity from the leadership at Walgreens. Well, that'll do it for us this week on the Retail Focus podcast. Again, for Leighton behind the scenes, I'm Trent saying so long until next week. Again, we'll be joined by Dick Sullivan, the CEO, PGA Tour Superstore, and former CMO of Home Depot. We'll be back 7 days from now.
This has been the Retail Focus Podcast. For more, visit our website at retailfocuspodcast.com and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter at Retail Podcast.